Hey guys, welcome back. Mr. Boring here for the entire US history team, and I have got video number 3 in our remote learning series. This one's going to be different from our previous two, which were all about the civil rights. Now we're going to start looking back out at the Cold War, at the foreign policy endeavors of the United States, and of course, if we're in the 1960s, we are talking about the Vietnam War. Now, no issue for the United States over the course of the last 60, 70 years has possibly been more important than the Vietnam War. And of course, I'm thinking about that post-World War II time frame. The Vietnam War has been the lens through which we have made political foreign policy decisions, domestic policy decisions. We think about ourselves as Americans increasingly with regards to protest movements, with the struggle for being felt like we are listened to by our government. All of that is run through the lens, the prism of the Vietnam War. And in fact, if you take a look back at the last handful of presidential elections, whether it be President Trump's deferments during the Vietnam War, the 5 deferments that he got, or it was prior to that, John McCain and his war service and his subsequent captivity as a prisoner of war after he was shot down over North Vietnam, serving in the Navy. Or before that, it was the Bush and Kerry elections, where we see the standoff between the Swift Boat for Truth movement and President Bush's service as a reservist in the Air Force. The Vietnam War has shaped much of our political debate, our social debate, and a lot of our foreign policy and domestic policy endeavors, for better or for worse, depending on where you lie or stand on that political spectrum. And so it's something that we really definitely need to take a look at. So what we're going to do is try to take a wide view, wide-angled approach to the Vietnam War and track the progression of the United States becoming embroiled in Vietnam, and then how the United States endeavored to get out of Vietnam. Most of our discussion is going to be in the 1960s, but to really get a strong understanding of the Vietnam War, you got to go all the way back to the Treaty of Versailles and the end of World War I. And of course, you will remember that at the end of World War I, there was a lot of debate over should colonies be able to self-determine their future. Should the victorious powers keep their colonial holdings? Did Woodrow Wilson have enough political capital on the global stage and in the United States to endeavor for a freer, more open, more democratic world? And we know that while hopes were very high at the beginning of that Paris Peace process, by the end, the United States had kind of fallen out of favor in terms of being a shot caller because of the obstruction of the Republicans in Congress not wanting to cede sovereign powers to global endeavors such as the League of Nations. And we see that many of the colony holding European states, and most importantly amongst these for this discussion, the French, won out in terms of holding their colonies. And that's really important because one of the people who was in Paris at this time lobbying for peace was a man who we are going to call Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh views all of the Vietnam War, what will happen with the French, the beginnings of the American involvement in Vietnam, as colonialist outsiders trying to hold his people under his control. And at various times, he will be linked with democratic states. At various times, he'll be linked with communists. But more than anything else, Ho Chi Minh would have viewed his movement, his Viet Minh movement, as a nationalist liberation movement. And so when the Vietnamese petition for self-determination at Versailles is denied, and then subsequently when during World War II, the Viet Minh fight against the Japanese, who have installed a puppet regime under Bao Dai, and the Viet Minh and Ho Chi Minh still are not able to secure national liberation from French colonial power. Ho Chi Minh says to himself, well, if the democratic states, the free states, the capitalist states aren't going to help me, then I'll turn to the other major power during the Cold War, which are going to be the communists. And so Ho Chi Minh decides he will become a communist. He will endeavor to secure a free Vietnam using communist support and backing. And it's out of World War II that we really start to see those early seeds of what will become the American Vietnam War start to be planted, right? And a lot of that is owed to the fact that the French again refused to give up their colonial holdings, but the like link to the victorious powers, even though Ho Chi Minh had fought on the side with his Viet Minh liberation forces on the side of the Allies against the Japanese who were holding Vietnam during the Second World War, the French and the Allied powers decided, you know what, we're not going to turn over complete and total control to Viet Minh forces or anybody else. We'll partition the country. In the southern part of the country will fall under the control of Bao Dai, who's very much seen as a puppet of Western colonialists. He was seen as a puppet, installed by the Japanese during the time of the Second World War. And so he's not very popular with a lot of the Vietnamese people, but the country's been divided up at the 17th parallel to create a North and a South Vietnam, very, very similar to what we saw in Korea. And in the southern part of the country, you start to see this secularization, this Western secularization start to take place under Bao Dai, where we see a push towards the adoption of Western culture, Western religion, most importantly, Roman Catholic religion, and this really strong link to Western secular belief systems. And for people who are traditionally Buddhist, people who are traditionally of a much smaller, less secular, family-linked, agrarian, sociocultural background, many of the Vietnamese outside of the major cities weren't really having this. And so the United States and the secular Western powers, mainly backing the southern section of the country, are trying to hold a peace between the North, who are increasingly being backed by now a communist China and by the Soviet Union, who are looking to spread their ideology in the West. And then we run full into the domino theory and the containment issues that really contextualized the 1950s and the Western American approach to holding back communism. And a lot of this finally culminates in this civil war that'll start to take place between communist insurgent forces led by Ho Chi Minh. They're going to be called the Viet Minh, and the Western forces, who will be the French on the ground, but really is the United States, and NATO, and the Western powers. And it's seen from the perspective of the Vietnamese people and Ho Chi Minh as a war of liberation. Let's get rid of these people holding us under their control. From the perspective of the French and the United States, this is seen as a communist incursion, very similar to what happened in Korea. So we start to see these shades of the Cold War really starting to influence policy. And so what you have in the American and French perspective is communists trying to come in and take over South Vietnam and create a communist country. There's a series of battles that are fought, and these battles will culminate in this epic valley battle called Dien Bien Phu. And at Dien Bien Phu, the French kind of make their last stand. It almost becomes like a French colonial Alamo, where the French create a massive base. They get stranded inside of their base. The communists are on the hillsides. The French are at the valley floor. They're being shelled. They're being attacked nightly. The communists are digging trenches and tunnels to break into Dien Bien Phu. Eventually, the mighty French fall to the peasant army, again, shades of the American Revolution, if you will, and the French are forced to cede the field. And it looks like, from Ho Chi Minh's perspective, that the Vietnamese have secured victory and have secured a unified, liberated Vietnam, which had been his goal all the way back to 1918, 1919 at Versailles, right? And so he thinks he's victorious. Unfortunately, when we get to the bargaining table, which will take place in Switzerland at Geneva, we call these the First Geneva Accords. There is a a contentious peace process that ultimately does not lead to a unified free Vietnam the way that Ho Chi Minh had hoped for, but instead a continued to be divided, culturally divided, geographically divided, politically set of Vietnams. The South Vietnamese regime will be under the control of this guy, Ngo Diem. And Diem, he's a Catholic. He's seen to be more stable and more trustworthy, mainly by the United States. Again, we're in the Cold War, so the United States is really the hand behind the scenes, moving everything forward from the perspective of the Eisenhower administration and chiefly of Vice President Richard Nixon. Diem is a man that can be relied upon. He is a man who can hold back communism. Eisenhower had famously run for and won re-election throughout the 1950s by saying that he would hold back the spread of communism. He had very famously campaigned in 1950 on the idea of losing China to the communists, the creation of Red China. And so his regime is looking for a way to firewall off Southeast Asia from communist incursions. And they like Diem as the political leader of the South. Now, Diem is going to be very, very unpopular, right? And he's the type of person that does not represent the socio-cultural background of Vietnam, but much more so the socio-cultural background of the French and the secular West. So immediately there's this like poison pill almost inserted into the Geneva Accords. And while the Americans feel really, really good about the peace process that's been put in place, the reality is that Diem is not the candidate that is really going to bring peace and stability. And so in 1956, there's an accord to essentially try, under this Geneva Accords, there's a provision in the accord to try to unify North and South Vietnam under an election. And so there's this settlement of political problems affected on the basis of respect for the principles of independence, unity, and territorial integrity shall permit the Vietnamese people to enjoy the fundamental freedoms guaranteed by democratic institutions established by the right of free democratic elections by secret ballot. And what all that looks like is it's really, really good. But in fact, that the reality is that the elections are not going to go well. And when the elections don't go well, what happens is North and South Vietnam are essentially partitioned. And so in the North, where you have the industrial centers, the major ports, the major access to industry and finance and capital, that's going to all fall into communist hands. And in the South, where there's much more of the agrarian base, where you got a lot more farmers, that's going to fall into two distinct political divisions. You're going to have the rural farming areas like in the South in the Mekong Delta. Those are going to be really impoverished. They're going to be people who are going to be felt like they're going to be forgotten by the Diem government. And then you're going to have the cities like Saigon, which are seen as more of just like the bastion of the West. And so the Geneva Accords ultimately fail. And instead of inspiring any sort of trust in the process, the failure of the elections, the division of the country, and then the subsequent role the United States CIA plays in trying to drum up the vote and drum up support, all this does is start to sow seeds of doubt inside the Vietnamese population that will continue to grow through the end of the 1950s and into the 1960s. And so Diem's government will constantly and consistently be under attack by coups and will be highly, highly unstable, right? So Diem's got a lot of problems when he comes into power. He has this idea of this democratic one-man rule that the U.S. is going to back. But because he's a Catholic and because he feels like he's got dictatorial powers, he's not going to be accepted by the Buddhists and the traditional people, as we've already said. And so one of the groups of people who increasingly become attacked by Diem are the Buddhists. And for him to do this, he's going to install his brother, Ngo Dien Nhu. And Nhu is going to be the type of person who is, somewhat sadistic. There's shades of him, like a Heinrich Himmler, Gestapo type mentality to the way he wants to run, or the Cheka and the KGB and the NKVD in the Soviet Union. He's the type of guy who wants to push down and utilize repressive tactics against his political enemies. And the main political enemy is going to be the Buddhists. At the same time, Diem, from a political standpoint, wants to utilize land reform because he wants to increase the value of his economy because he's lost all that industrial base up in the north. And what ends up happening is that he pisses off a lot of people, right? The outskirts, the rural areas, a lot of these people become angry, and so flooding to the city, you have Buddhists, you have students who have been westernized, but who are looking at this and saying, hey, what's happening in our country is not like democratic values. This is more of a dictatorship. You have people out in the country who are losing their lands, losing their livelihood to these reforms. And it culminates in a series of protests that were widely visible, the monk burning protests and subsequent coups to try to destabilize the regime. And all of this is happening with the backdrop of the United States continuing to fight the Cold War. We see leading through the end of the 50s and up into the 1960s. You've got Richard Nixon running against JFK. So you've got the missile gap, and you've got the great debates about who's going to be the better champion for holding back communism. Is it going to be the red baiting, red scare tactics of Nixon, or is it going to be the future is looking really bright and sunny? We just need to really knuckle down and create a better America. JFK. We know that JFK wins the election. While there's this kind of uncertainty in the American political process about which way the American government is going to go, whether it's going to be the really strong, like Allen Dulles influenced foreign policy to help support Diem in South Vietnam, or is it going to be Kennedy? And Kennedy's going to be a little bit more skeptical. He'll stand up to the communists when he needs to, like think about in Berlin or the Cuban Missile Crisis. But Kennedy also wasn't as cavalier about fighting as Nixon would have been. And so all this political uncertainty, the protests in South Vietnam, they all culminate in these monk burning protests. There's a subsequent coup. Diem will eventually be assassinated because of his repressive tactics. And there's all this uncertainty going on. And if you're somebody like Ho Chi Minh and the communist forces up in North Vietnam, these are fertile fields to really actually start to influence the political process in the South and continue to work towards your ultimate goal of unification. So communist forces start coming south. You've got the American political fear about the Cold War. You start to see more and more communists insurgents starting to move into South Vietnam. And now the stage is actually set for some American involvement. And so Kennedy is going to have limited involvement starting in 1960 to start to push back against communist forces, because from his perspective, the spread of communism isn't good. But again, he's not going to be the out front, hard charging Eisenhower, Allen Dulles, what would have been Richard Nixon type of personality. Kennedy, clashes very famously with Dulles and ends up firing Dulles. And removing him from the CIA. The American involvement under Kennedy is this slow, kind of small buildup of what he calls American advisors to help the ARVN, the army of the South Vietnamese forces, right? And so the ARVN, ARVN, are going to be advised by Americans who are fighting in South Vietnam along with them against communist insurgents. But you're going to see like more American technology and less American troops. And then Dallas happens in 1963 and Kennedy is assassinated and LBJ takes over. And LBJ is willing to make some concessions to more the hawkish members of the Republican and Democratic parties who want to push back against communism. He's willing to do this because he's doing the political calculus, and he's saying, if I want to enact the Great Society, the civil rights changes and the social welfare programs of the mid-1960s that LBJ probably would have been known for most famously had it not been the Vietnam War, which really spirals out of control during his administration. he says, listen, I will go ahead and I will make these concessions. We'll kind of build up a little bit more in Vietnam if you're willing to back my play for a lot of these domestic policy reforms to kind of round out and push forward the New Deal, which LBJ had ridden in on in the 1930s during FDR's administration. And so now you've got this like really tense set of circumstances where you've got this slowly like burgeoning conflict that's becoming more and more Americanized through 1963 and 1964 in Vietnam. But the calculus here from LBJ is, well, I got to make these concessions if I want to make sure that my domestic agenda is fulfilled. The Great Society legislation and the war on poverty is one, so I'll make this deal, right? And that turns out to be a real devil's deal for LBJ, because while he's able to succeed early on with his Great Society endeavors, the war in Vietnam really starts to spiral out of control. And all of this culminates in depending on your perspective, a disastrous piece of legislation that comes out of Congress in 1964, which is called the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. And this is highly contentious, and I don't want to get too far into the weeds of this, but what needs to be understood about the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution of August 1964 is that there's this report, the USS Maddox is attacked by communist forces led by, the North Vietnamese Navy, which is not really much of a navy at all. The Maddox is a spy ship. It's sailing off the coast of North Vietnam in Vietnamese waters. It's shot up by this North Vietnamese PT boat patrolling the Gulf of Tonkin. Johnson goes to Congress with a resolution that gives him congressional support to, quote, take all necessary measures to repel any armed attack against the forces of the United States to prevent further aggression. Right, the Senate will, famously vote on this 88-2. Right, this is highly popular at the time. Johnson gets to look like he's really tough on the war. He gets to fulfill some of the political back deal promises that he's made about pushing back against Congress. Congress cedes a lot of authority over to the executive branch. War will never be declared in Vietnam. The resolution empowers LBJ and then later Richard Nixon to kind of call the shots and have their own personal war cabinet, war board outside of the purview of Congress, because Congress has allowed for the executive branch to intercede and start calling the shots, right? And at first, this doesn't seem like that much of a problem, but what we start to see is there's this slow buildup of forces and of aggressive actions, right? So you'll see, very quickly after the Gulf of Tonkin resolution by 1965, there's going to be 500,000 American service members on the ground in Vietnam. You'll see Operation Rolling Thunder begin, which will be part of really the landscape of the Vietnam War for the entirety of the war, which is massive aerial bombardments. So those big B-52s that were meant to fly into the Soviet Union and drop nukes are instead outfitted with traditional bombs that are being flown over North Vietnamese cities like Hanoi. And we're seeing massive carpet bombing, like World War II style bombing. There's this effort to continue to break down the willpower of the North Vietnamese. At the same time, the United States will move personnel, no longer advisors, but actual combat personnel into the South, and they'll try to pacify the countryside by doing what Johnson basically believes is a Tennessee Valley Authority style project, where he will move into the countryside, he'll electrify, he'll improve the lives of the people of South Vietnam so that they have a better living conditions, and he will root out the Viet Cong, who are like the insurgent fighters now of the North. Ho Chi Minh is dead, but his cause lives on, and he will root these people out. Any invading North Vietnamese army members who are stationed in South Vietnam, he will find them. The policy of the United States Army during this time to destroy these forces is called search and destroy, where literally the goal was, we don't need to worry about the land. We don't need to worry about holding territory. We're not fighting a traditional war. We're fighting against an idea, not an enemy. So all we have to do is kill the idea, and then we can just turn the land back over to the South Vietnamese, and we could have killed communism, right? That's the goal. So how do you do this? you kill as many of the people as possible who are spreading that idea. And so search and destroy literally becomes about body counts. The body count figures will always be inflated, right? The brainchild behind all of this is Robert McNamara. McNamara had been a top advisor to President Kennedy before that, when he was working in World War II and working for the Ford Motor Corporation. He was a technocrat. He was a by the numbers sort of person. So he just basically says, if we just start doing the math and we start figuring out how many people are killed, we can graph out the break point for the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong insurgents. And if we just destroy enough of their political and logistic base in South Vietnam, we will win the war, right? That's McNamara's thought process. Search and destroy will always suffer from inflated body counts. We'll see that the policy and strategy becomes perverted, where we're just going to be killing anybody and calling them the Viet Cong. Many Vietnam War movies have very dramatically shown this. I'm thinking like a Full Metal Jacket, for example, where we start to see this idea of everybody's a communist, everybody's a Viet Cong, so kill them all. It leads to stuff like the My Lai massacre, which is one of the worst, most horrible events of the American military in the 20th century, where you see hundreds of innocent people killed, villages destroyed. We start to see the logic behind, like, we had to destroy the village to save it. All of this just to say that fighting this war became really, really messy, really, really fast, right? And more troops are starting to be needed to pacify these regions. And so you get like people like General Westmoreland, who start continuously asking for more and more soldiers, right? Through 1964, 65, and 66, though, the war is not overly negative in terms of the American people and how they perceive the war, right? Starting in 67 and then really culminating in 1968, though, is a series of events. So by 1967, the draft is being instituted to start to fill the ranks of the American military. And so you're starting to see college kids, the generation that we call today the baby boom generation, being asked to go out and fight the war. Now, for a lot of these kids, they're living a very comfortable life. The 1960s, we're getting closer and closer to the summer of love. This idea of living this like really good, relaxed life in the United States, the ideals of conformity, those are really starting to set in. A lot of the people who are being drafted don't want to go to Vietnam. All right, so we start to see public protests and sentiment turned away from Vietnam. And then in 1968, the Tet Offensive happens. Now, the Tet is like Lunar New Year. It had been a holiday that up to 1968 had been a de facto ceasefire time period between the ARVN, the United States, the Viet Cong, and the NVA, the North Vietnamese Army. So nobody fought during Tet. But in 1968, the Viet Cong launched an offensive. And while the offensive ultimately fails, no major cities are toppled, while there's like horrible battles that are fought in places like Hue is the setting for the culminating scene in Full Metal Jacket. The Tet Offensive ultimately fails. The United States Embassy falls for a short period of time, but is taken back by United States forces. Saigon, where insurgents try to take over the city, is very quickly pacified. It's where we get this very awful photo here we have on the screen. But what ends up happening at Tet is that we start to see the American public turn, because Tet is fought in front of TV cameras, right? So you get people like Edward R. Murrow, who famously says, following the Tet Offensive, he sees no pathway towards victory coming out of Tet. He's viewed as the most trustworthy man in America in 1968, and public sentiment really turns on the Vietnam War after the Tet Offensive. So while from a military standpoint, it's a victory for the United States, and the Viet Cong will never recover, and in the increasing amount of fighting will be shouldered by the NVA, the result, though, is that America loses its political will to fight. And this is where you get all the protestations. This is where you get the movements, the hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today? Chants that start to take place, and the destruction of Johnson's political career. And so in 1968, Johnson says, hey, listen, I will not seek nor will I accept the nomination for my party for president of the United States. He eschews his second term. Why? Vietnam has been such a disaster for him, right? And so in 1968, we see the possibility for a new set of candidates, right? From the Democrat side, the Democrats will basically never get their stuff together to field an actual true candidate that could win the election against a really strong Republican. And the Democratic Party is really sowed into chaos. Their best chance at winning the White House was Bobby Kennedy. Bobby Kennedy is assassinated in California in 1968. The convention is contested. I'll be posting a podcast on that next week. For my students, it's the Democratic Party. It falls into disarray. In the Republican camp, you have these two different competing groups. You have Barry Goldwater on one side. Barry Goldwater is a war hawk. He wants to nuke the North Vietnamese forces. He wants to really create a strong American fighting force in North Vietnam. He wants to win the war. And then you have Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon is a political mainstay, right? So if Goldwater is the insurgent, Nixon represents like the status quo, and he is going to be able to tap into some of the American political discontent that takes place after 1965 to ultimately win the election. So Goldwater represents like the really hardcore conservative ideal. Nixon seems to be a little bit more the centrist. They're kind of locked in this heated race between the two of them, and then Nixon courts the South. And Nixon is able to wrap up a lot of the Southern Democrats who had left the party because of the civil rights legislation of the mid-1960s that LBJ had put in to his Great Society Acts, right? And so the Democrats, the segregationists, people like George Wallace, leave the Democratic Party, join the Republican Party, and they back Richard Nixon, who's courting them, who's saying, hey, listen, we'll slow down the civil rights legislation, and Nixon wins. And one of the first things Nixon says is, I don't want to be this war. I don't want this war. Nixon is kind of a dichotomy. He's going to be like one of the quintessential Cold Warriors of the Cold War time period, but he's also the first president to go into Red China. He will court the Soviet Union. His policies détente will help to lead to some of the loosening of those Cold War tensions, and will lead to the nuclear missile treaties like SALT and SALT I and SALT II that we talked about during the Cold War, that ultimately will be responsible for moving towards the INF and the creation of nuclear arms limitation, which plays a really large role in ending the Cold War. So Nixon is kind of dichotomous, right? So he says, like, I'll fight back against the communists, but I'll also work with the communists when I can, when it's to my advantage. So one of the things that Nixon starts to do is he empowers his national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, to start to look for a peaceful exit strategy to Vietnam, because he doesn't want his presidency to go the same way as Lyndon Johnson's did because of the war. So he announces this policy of Vietnamization, where the ARVN and the South Vietnamese forces will increasingly take on the responsibility of fighting against the North Vietnamese, and the Americans will slowly start to draw back their forces. This is a failure, right? The ARVN is never going to be an adequate fighting force. They're never going to have the same the passion or zeal that the North Vietnamese have. So when the North Vietnamese and the ARVN meet each other on the battlefield, it's always a North Vietnamese victory. The only thing holding back the North Vietnamese forces is the United States. Increasingly, those North Vietnamese forces are getting savvy, too, about utilizing international law and the limitations that the United States is going to be forced to recognize to get an upper hand on the South. So the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which is this massive network of supply lines that will run through Laos and Cambodia, is used to start ferrying supplies and troops and medical equipment, food to the South Vietnamese Viet Cong, and then later to the NVA that are in South Vietnam. And because these trails are moving through other non-combatant countries, there's a legality issue of how do you attack these trails? Well, the Nixon administration says, to hell with that. We'll invade Cambodia if we have to. That's platoon. Or we will bomb it out if we need to, utilizing these massive airstrikes, very similar to Operation Rolling Thunder, to help to create the conditions necessary to win the war. And this will be highly contentious as well. And so you'll see these huge demonstrations that'll take place all across the country. Of course, this will lead to Kent State. We'll talk more about Kent State next week, where the National Guard fires on one of these peaceful protests and 4 people lay dead at the end of this clash. There'll be massive protests at the White House. Washington, D.C. will be on lockdown as a result of all of this. And so by 1971, the American forces under Nixon start to withdraw, and the United States starts to look for a more peaceful passage towards peace. Now, the United States essentially will abandon the war effort very, very quickly by 1972. The embassy will be abandoned. That's where you get the very famous helicopters with all the people lining, going up the ladders to get to the helicopters. You see the pictures and the video of Huey helicopters and the big Chinook helicopters being pushed off of aircraft carriers into sea to make way for the new ones that are landing, because they're just trying to evacuate as many people as possible. Why? Because there's going to be hell to pay when these South Vietnamese cities finally fall. And so small numbers of Americans stay in place. The United States Navy and Air Force will continue to operate into the later stages of the peace process. This idea of peace with honor, where the United States will protect the South Vietnamese people as much as they can. But at the end of the day, as South Vietnamese cities and regions start to fall under control of the North Vietnamese, anybody who is seen as an enemy to the communist revolution was executed, right? And we've seen this before in revolutionary wars, that if you're on the opposing side, unfortunately, usually you get a quick trial and a bullet. And that's what ends up starting to happen in South Vietnam. So you have this massive humanitarian crisis of trying to get as many people out of South Vietnam as possible. You very famously get the boat people who are going to escape to the sea from Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam, South Vietnam, to try to make it out to Navy ships and humanitarian aid groups who are going to be off the coast in international waters to pick these people up and ferry them to the West for safety. Some of the people who had aided the United States, like the Hmong people and the Montagnards, they will be targeted by the South Vietnamese as well, or excuse me, the now communist South Vietnamese forces. And they will be executed as well, and you get this humanitarian crisis. And so by the end of the Vietnam War, some of the ironies that end up existing are that because of all the destabilization, all the animus, and all the destruction, you see in very quick order, South Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia all become communist countries. So that idea of the domino theory, unfortunately, does kind of come to fruition. Whether or not that would have happened without the Vietnam War is highly debatable. But the stage is now set for a very red communist bloc in Southeast Asia. You're going to see all sorts of human rights tragedies. Many of you learned about the killing fields of Cambodia and Pol Pot last year in world history. This is that time period that allows for this to occur. The United States will not want to move in to fight back against any of these forces. In fact, from about 1974, 75 onwards, really up until Grenada in 83, we won't see the United States really engage militarily or overtly. And it's really not until Operation Desert Storm in 1991 where the United States kind of gets that Vietnam syndrome fear about getting stuck in a horrible war out of its system, right? So like I said, I know this was a long one, but it's a really, really complex subject. I'll post the notes just like I've done in the past for you guys. Thanks for hanging in there. Hope you enjoyed it. Bye.